I want you to picture, just for a second, the absolute best person in your field.
Oh, yeah. We all have that one person in mind.
Right. Think about that one professional you know, or maybe you've just, watched them from afar, who just makes the impossible look entirely, almost frustratingly effortless.
Frustrating is definitely the right word for it.
It really is. You know the exact type of person I'm talking about. While everyone else around them is like sweating and frantic and just totally overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of a problem, they are moving with this quiet, deliberate grace.
Yeah, they're just completely unbothered.
Exactly. The crisis hits, the servers go down, the client completely loses their mind, the supply chain breaks, and this person they just handle it.
They step right into the chaos and they impose order.
Without even raising their heart rate. And it makes you wonder, how do we even begin to describe that level of skill? What are the actual words we use when someone has transcended just being like good at their job and has entered a totally different stratosphere of competence?
Well, it becomes a real linguistic puzzle, honestly. Yeah. Because when we hit those extreme upper limits of human capability, everyday language it kind of buckles under the weight of it.
Yeah, it's just not enough.
Right. You can't just look at someone performing at that insane level and say, they are highly competent.
No, that sounds ridiculous.
It feels woefully insufficient. It's too sterile, too corporate. It completely fails to capture the magic or the sheer psychological weight or even the historical depth of what you are actually witnessing in that moment.
And that tension between the really sterile corporate language we normally use and the profound reality of true excellence is exactly what we are unpacking today in this deep dive.
Which I am very excited about.
Me too, because we've got this fascinating source material to go through. It's an excerpt from a C2 Advanced English Language program, and it's titled The Master's Path.
Yeah.
But looking through this, I realized almost immediately that it's not a vocabulary lesson.
Yeah.
We aren't here to just memorize dictionary definitions today.
Definitely not.
The source is actually like a map of human excellence, hidden right there inside the idioms of the English language.
Yeah, and that's because language at the C2 level, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is the absolute highest level of certified proficiency, it operates differently than what we learn in introductory classes.
Right. It's not just, where's the library?
Exactly. At the lower levels, language is purely utilitarian. You learn how to say, the report is finished, or she is an effective manager. But when you reach C2, the vocabulary becomes highly anthropological.
Anthropological, I love that.
It relies heavily on evocative storytelling. It taps directly into our collective human memory. So we start using metaphors of intense physical labor, of survival, of ancient architecture, just to describe abstract intellectual achievements.
And that's the part that really hooked me. We are going on an exploration today of the conceptual journey of mastery, tracing the path from being, a mere beginner to the absolute peak of peerless skill, and finally to the monumental act of leaving a permanent legacy.
It's quite the arc.
It is. And we are going to do it by looking at how human beings use these incredibly ancient, visceral, almost violent images, things like blacksmithing, heavy agriculture, and monumental stonemasonry to describe modern desk jobs.
It's quite the contrast, isn't it?
It's wild. The idea that someone's sitting in a ergonomic chair, typing on a mechanical keyboard in a climate-controlled office is described using the exact same language as a medieval swordsmith. There is a massive disconnect there that just begs to be analyzed.
But the disconnect is intentional. We use those physical, ancient metaphors because, on a deep psychological and neurological level, true intellectual or creative mastery demands the exact same toll as physical mastery.
Oh, wow. So the brain literally doesn't know the difference.
Right. The brain recognizes the parallel, even if the modern professional's hands are perfectly clean. The cognitive friction required to, say, master a coding language or to become a world-class trial lawyer is virtually identical to the physical friction required to forge a weapon.
So let's start right there at the very beginning of this conceptual journey. Because you don't just wake up a master.
Unfortunately not.
Right. You have to transition out of that initial phase where you are just, learning the ropes, where you're basically just figuring out where the coffee machine is and how the basic software works.
That's a foundational phase.
Yeah. And the text introduces our first idiom for this solitary transition, and it's a phrase we hear all the time: honing your craft.
Oh, yes.
The definition provided is to continually, obsessively refine and perfect specific skills over a very long period. But I want to look really closely at the word hone, because the source points out the literal translation, and it is a beautifully tactile object. A hone, or a whetstone, is this heavy, flat, incredibly dense block of stone used to meticulously sharpen a blade.
And to really understand the implications of honing, we have to consider the physical reality of that whetstone.
Okay, walk me through it.
Well, if a blacksmith wants to change the fundamental shape of a piece of metal, they heat it in a forge and strike it with a hammer.
Right, big, heavy blows.
Exactly. A hammer is explosive, it's fast, and it relies entirely on blunt force. But a hammer cannot create a razor-sharp edge.
No, it would just flatten it.
Right. Creating an edge is an agonizingly slow process. It requires the repetitive, precise sliding of cold steel against rough stone.
And the text makes a point to emphasize that friction. It's not about heat or sparks flying everywhere. It's about the microscopic removal of imperfections. You are literally scraping away tiny, almost invisible layers of the metal.
Layer by agonizing layer.
Yeah. And if we take that tactile image and apply it to a modern context, say a software developer or a classical pianist, the metaphor suggests that early mastery is essentially an act of abrasion.
Abrasion is the perfect word for it.
You are just dragging your brain against a problem over and over at the exact same angle until the dullness of your understanding is worn away.
That abrasion is really the defining characteristic of the first stage of the master's path. True mastery requires a physical-like resistance.
You have to push against something hard.
Yes. You don't master Python coding or the cello in a sudden flash of explosive inspiration.
It's not the hammer.
Exactly. It's not the hammer. The inspiration might give you the shape of the idea, like the hammer on the anvil, but it doesn't give you the edge. The edge only comes from the discipline of repetition, from encountering resistance and slowly grinding it down.
The source uses a really specific illustrative example here that I found quite striking. It describes a painter who spends 20 years alone in a studio honing his craft before he ever sells a single painting.
20 years.
Not 2 years, not 5 years, 20. The sheer scale of that time commitment is staggering. Imagine what day 4,000 looks like in that studio compared to day 10.
The differences would be imperceptible to anyone else.
Right. The adjustments must become so microscopic.
And that timescale perfectly encapsulates the reality of the whetstone. 20 years of minute adjustments. What that painter is doing on day 4,000 is, like you said, likely invisible to the untrained eye.
They're just barely touching the canvas.
Yeah, they are adjusting the mixture of a pigment by a fraction of a percent, or maybe just altering the pressure of a single brushstroke. But those microscopic adjustments, accumulated over decades, are what eventually constitute mastery.
But looking closely at the text, there is a specific word used to describe this process that I want to challenge, or at least, examine more critically.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text says you must obsessively focus on this refinement. And the metaphor itself, the lone blacksmith at the whetstone, the painter alone in the studio for 20 years, it implies total isolation.
It does.
So my question is honing inherently a lonely process? Because the modern workplace is incredibly collaborative. We work on massive teams, we have daily stand-up meetings, we're constantly communicating on Slack. How does the solitary nature of the whetstone fit into a hyper-connected professional world?
Well, the collaboration you are talking about happens at the level of the project, but the cognitive act of refinement, the actual honing, remains intensely personal and isolated.
Even in a busy office.
Oh, absolutely. You could be sitting in a bustling open plan office surrounded by 50 other engineers, but when you are tracing a complex bug deep in the architecture of a software program, you are entirely alone.
That's true. No one else is inside your head.
Right. No one else can feel that specific cognitive friction for you. No one else can sense exactly when your understanding of that system becomes sharp. So that obsession the text mentions, it's an internal state.
Okay, so even if I'm physically surrounded by a team, the actual mechanism of getting better at my specific craft is a solo endeavor. I have to be the one sliding the steel against the stone.
Precisely. The collaboration is the application of the sharp blade, but the sharpening itself happens in isolation. The spotlight, the applause, the team celebrations, the promotions. Those are just the public rewards for the private act of honing.
That brings up a critical problem, though. Let's say you do it. You spend the 20 years in the metaphorical darkroom. You scrape, you slide, you grind away at your skills, and you genuinely believe you've sharpened your blade.
You've put in the time.
You think you've honed your craft. But If you are in the dark, if you are isolated, how do you actually know if the blade is sharp?
Ah.
Because a dull sword and a razor-sharp sword look pretty much identical when the lights are off.
And that is the fatal flaw of the whetstone. You cannot judge the efficacy of mastery in a vacuum.
You need a test.
Exactly. A master who has never been tested is merely a theoretician. To know if the edge is actually there, you have to introduce a crisis.
Which takes us right into the next conceptual stage the source outlines, the ultimate filter.
This is where it gets real.
Yeah, the text explains that a moment of intense pressure is what actually tests the honed craft. It calls a crisis the ultimate filter, which, in the C2 English idiom provided, is described as separating the wheat from the chaff.
Which represents a massive shift in the imagery.
How so?
Well, we leave the confined, dark space of the blacksmith's forge and move out into the wide open, highly exposed space of the agricultural fields.
Okay, yes. And the specific mechanism of this agricultural metaphor is fascinating, but I need you to break it down for me because I think a lot of us are completely detached from how grain is actually harvested.
Fair enough.
The text mentions throwing harvested plants into the air on a windy day. How exactly does this act as a filter?
So the process is called winnowing. When wheat is harvested in a pre-mechanized society, you don't just pluck a clean grain from the stalk. The edible, highly valuable, nutritionally dense grain, which is the wheat, is tightly encased inside a dry, protective, papery outer shell, which is known as the chaff.
Okay.
When it sits in the harvesting basket, the wheat and the chaff are inextricably mixed together, and the chaff is useless. It has no nutritional value, and you can't digest it.
So you have a basket full of a mixture, and you desperately need the dense grain, but you have to get rid of the papery shell.
Correct. And because the chaff is wrapped so tightly around the grain, you can't simply pick it apart by hand. I mean, it would take thousands of hours.
Nobody has time for that.
Exactly. So farmers use the physical properties of the materials against each other. The wheat grain is dense. It has physical substance and weight.
Right.
The chaff, on the other hand, is incredibly lightweight, almost like tissue paper. So on a day with strong winds, farmers take large, flat baskets of this mixture and violently toss the contents straight up into the air.
Okay, so the whole mixture goes airborne.
Yes, and in that brief moment when everything is suspended in the air, gravity and wind take over.
Nature does the work.
Precisely. Because the wheat grain is heavy and has density, it resists the wind. Gravity pulls it straight back down into the basket. But the chaff, lacking any real substance, gets instantly caught by the wind and is blown completely away, just scattering across the field.
That is a phenomenal visual. And the text connects this directly to professional mastery. The idiom separating the wheat from the chaff means distinguishing the truly skilled, authentic experts from the amateurs, the fakes, and the pretenders.
It's the ultimate test of substance.
But looking at the mechanics of the metaphor, the most important element isn't the wheat or the chaff, it's the wind.
Yes.
The wind represents the crisis. It represents the sudden, uncontrollable external pressure that the professional has to face.
The wind is the active agent of the ultimate filter. Because, think about it, without the wind, the wheat and the chaff sit peacefully together in the basket, completely indistinguishable from one another.
They look exactly the same.
Right. In a calm environment, when there is zero pressure and everything is operating smoothly, you cannot tell who is an authentic master and who is merely wearing the papery shell of competence. It is remarkably easy to look like an expert when the conditions are perfect.
And the source gives a couple of really sharp examples to illustrate this. It mentions a rigorous entrance exam acting as a filter, but the broader example it uses is economic, which I think is so relatable.
Oh, the boom and bust cycle.
Yes. It points out how a booming economy allows almost anyone to make money. When the stock market is experiencing a massive bull run and every single graph is trending up, every amateur day trader and inexperienced fund manager looks like a financial genius.
They're sitting in the basket, looking like wheat.
Exactly. But a booming economy is a winless day. The real test of the financial professional's mastery is the sudden arrival of a hurricane,
The crisis.
a global recession, a massive, unexpected market crash. That is the wind. And suddenly, the financial chaff, the people whose success was built on luck or reckless speculation or just riding the momentum of the boom, they lack the dense substance of true knowledge.
They get swept away.
The external pressure of the recession catches them, and they are blown entirely out of the industry. They lose their jobs, their funds collapse, they literally vanish. Meanwhile, the true financial masters, the wheat, they hold their ground.
Because of the whetstone.
Yes, they survived the crash because their skills were forged over 20 years in the dark. Their mastery gives them the heavy density required to drop straight back down and survive the wind.
It's a brutal but necessary mechanism.
But, and I want to push on this a bit, this framing makes me incredibly uncomfortable.
How so?
Well, does this mean we should actively desire a crisis?
Yeah.
Because naturally, as human beings, we are terrified of the wind.
Of course.
We hate recessions, we dread intense high-stakes exams, we absolutely panic when the servers crash at work, we spend millions of dollars trying to prevent these crises from ever happening. Are you saying the master actually wants the disaster to strike?
No, they don't desire the destruction of the disaster. But structurally, within the narrative of their own development, the wind is a deeply necessary cleansing mechanism.
Necessary why?
Because the master requires the crisis. As we established earlier, the 20 years of honing in the dark cannot be validated without it. If the wind never blows, the master has to spend their entire career sitting in the basket next to the fakes, treated as an equal by observers who can't tell the difference.
Oh, that would be maddening.
It would. The crisis is the ultimate theater of proof. The master doesn't want the market to crash, but when it inevitably does, it is the stage upon which their unseen, obsessive labor is finally rendered visible to the world.
Wow. Okay, so the wind dies down, the fakes are blown away, and the masters are the only ones left in the basket. But what happens next?
Well, life goes on.
Right. You don't just stop working, you have to go back to your job the next day. And the source text suggests that after this survival, the nature of the work itself begins to look fundamentally different.
It shifts gears.
Yeah, because of all that obsessive honing, the daily execution of their craft doesn't look like a frantic, desperate struggle to stay afloat anymore. It looks, well, it looks beautiful.
It really does.
Which leads us to the third conceptual stage, the aesthetics of flawless execution.
And this is a fascinating juncture in the language of the source text. We leave behind the gritty, abrasive imagery of the whetstone and the harsh, survival-based imagery of the agricultural wind, and the language suddenly elevates into the realm of high culture.
High culture. Right, because the text states that when a master executes their craft, they have it down to a fine art.
Down to a fine art.
The definition is that a task has been practiced so many thousands of times that it can be executed flawlessly, efficiently, and entirely without conscious thought. But I am totally captivated by the specific choice of the phrase fine art.
It's an interesting choice of words, isn't it?
It really is. The source explicitly notes that fine art traditionally refers to classical painting or marble sculpture or ballet disciplines that exist almost entirely for the purpose of supreme grace and aesthetic perfection.
It represents a profound synthesis of raw function and pure aesthetics. Well, when someone operates at the level of true mastery, even highly mechanical, purely functional tasks transcend their basic utility. The job stops being just a series of procedural steps required to achieve an outcome, and it becomes aesthetically pleasing to simply watch.
It's like a performance.
Exactly. There is a physical rhythm, a sort of kinetic poetry, to someone doing a complex job perfectly.
The example provided in the source is brilliant because it completely subverts the expectation of what fine art usually looks like. It doesn't use a painter or a poet or a ballet dancer.
No, it gets a completely different direction.
It uses a logistics team packing and shipping concert tour stages.
It's a profoundly blue-collar, physically grueling, highly industrial scenario.
Exactly. And I want to really build out this scene because it perfectly illustrates the concept. Imagine a road crew breaking down a massive rock concert stage at 2 a.m. in the pouring rain.
This is a miserable environment.
Yeah. You have semi-trucks backing up, thousands of pounds of steel scaffolding, miles of heavy cables, delicate lighting rigs, and a tight deadline to get to the next city by dawn. To an amateur, this environment should be absolute chaos.
Well, it should be a nightmare.
It should be full of screaming, panic, dropped equipment, and injuries. But because this crew consists of masters, because they have honed their craft and survived the filter of 50 different chaotic cities, they have it down to a fine art.
The contrast between the expected chaos and the actual execution is where the art emerges.
Yes, you can visualize it so vividly. Nobody is yelling over the noise. Every single crew crew member knows exactly where to stand before the truck even backs in. The heavy flake cases locked together in the back of the trailer like a giant silent game of Tetris.
Smooth and seamless.
The cables are coiled with an effortless flick of the wrist. The trucks are loaded with this breathtaking, sweeping efficiency. It is beautiful to witness. The sheer competence becomes an aesthetic experience for the observer.
It really does. But, there's a flip side of this.
Right, and this brings up a paradox from the text that I really struggled with.
Oh, the clockwork.
Yes. Right after describing this aesthetic beauty, the source uses another idiom to describe the master's execution. It runs like clockwork. No, wait a minute. Clockwork implies gears, metal teeth grinding together, rigid mechanical timing.
It conjures images of a soulless automaton.
Exactly. But fine art implies fluidity, emotion, human grace, and flexibility. How can a process be both at the same time? If I practice a task a million times, don't I just become a robot?
That's the assumption, isn't it?
Yeah. If I am packing a truck without even thinking about it, I'm just a zombie on autopilot. I'm not creating art. How does supreme repetition and rigid internal clockwork actually translate into external grace?
That is the ultimate paradox of human mastery. And to resolve it, we have to look briefly at how the brain actually optimizes learning.
Okay, lay it on me.
We instinctively assume that endless repetition breeds robotic rigidity. We think of an assembly line machine stamping out car parts. But human neurology is far more sophisticated than a simple machine.
Right.
When a human being repeats a complex physical or cognitive action thousands of times, whether it's packing a truck, performing microscopic open-heart surgery, or playing a Chopin nocturne, the brain begins to optimize the neural pathways.
It's building the internal clockwork.
Exactly. The brain is incredibly energy efficient. It doesn't want to expend high-level, conscious, cognitive energy on something you already know how to do. So it slowly delegates the mechanics of the task away from the conscious analytical part of the brain and pushes it down into the subconscious.
Down into muscle memory.
Yes, into muscle memory and the basal ganglia. The clockwork is the optimization of those neural pathways.
Okay, but if it's delegated to the subconscious, doesn't that just prove my point? You are operating thoughtlessly, like a machine.
It's actually the exact opposite.
Really? How so?
Because the conscious mind is suddenly freed from having to struggle with the how of the task. The body and the mind can deeply relax into the execution. Think about when you first learned to drive a manual transmission car.
Oh, God. It was awful.
Right. Every ounce of your conscious attention was focused on the rigid mechanics. Push the clutch, check the RPMs, move the stick, release the clutch. Your movements were jerky, stiff, and robotic.
Because I was thinking about every single step.
But 10 years later, you shift gears without a single conscious thought. The mechanics have become internal clockwork. And what is the result? Your driving becomes smooth, fluid, and relaxed.
Ah, I see. The relaxation is the key.
Yes, that deep relaxation, born from absolute trust in the internal clockwork, is what external observers perceive as fluidity and grace.
So the rigid discipline creates the freedom.
The rigid discipline of the whetstone creates the internal gears, but the external manifestation of that perfect internal machinery is pure grace. The master isn't a robot. They are so deeply attuned to the mechanics that they have completely transcended them.
They aren't thinking about where their hands go anymore.
Which frees their conscious mind to anticipate problems, adjust to sudden changes, and exist purely in a flow state. That flow state is the fine art.
That is a brilliant way to reconcile those two concepts. The clockwork handles the physics so the master can perform the art.
Exactly.
But achieving this level of flawless, unthinking flow state creates a new sociological problem. It elevates the master entirely out of the normal professional pool. You can no longer judge them on a standard performance review.
No, the scale that applies to regular employees no longer applies to them at all.
And that realization propels us into the fourth conceptual stage on the master's path. The lonely zenith.
To capture this phenomenon of extreme elevation, the source combines two deeply intertwined, highly evocative concepts describing peak performance.
Let's hear them.
The first is being in a league of your own, and the second is operating at the height of your powers.
I want to break down that sports metaphor first because it reveals a lot about how we organize human talent in a league of your own. The text details how, in sports like soccer, baseball, or basketball, teams are strictly grouped into leagues based on their skill level.
Right. The minor leagues play the minor leagues. The Premier Leagues play the Premier Leagues.
And the entire structural purpose of a league system is to artificially contain the standard deviation of skill. It ensures fair competition by creating a boundary where everyone on the field is roughly equal.
The league protects the integrity of the game.
Yeah.
If you put a Premier League team against a minor league team, the game breaks down.
It's not fun for anyone.
It stops being a competition and becomes a mathematically predetermined slaughter.
But true mastery breaks the boundaries of categorization. Imagine a professional who is so incredibly talented, whose honed skills are so statistically superior to everyone else in their so-called peer group that it actually becomes fundamentally unfair to compare them.
They warp the scale.
The master creates a massive distortion in the field. They are 3 or 4 standard deviations above the mean. The metaphor suggests that they require a theoretical, entirely separate league populated by only one person, themselves.
To be in a league of your own means to be completely peerless.
And the source quotes the cellist Yo-Yo Ma as the quintessential example of this peerlessness.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
There are thousands of brilliant, highly trained cellists playing in premier symphonies all around the world. These are people who have survived their own ultimate filters. But Yo-Yo Ma occupies a category of one.
When you discuss his playing, you aren't comparing him to the first chair of the London Symphony. You are analyzing a completely separate phenomenon.
And when you reach that isolated category of one, the text says you are operating at the height of your powers. I have to admit, I love the dramatic flair of this phrasing. We use it all the time, but when you stop and look at the words, it's intense.
It has incredibly strong literary and mythological undertones.
It really does. The source specifically notes that this phrase suggests human skill is a supernatural force. We don't look at a master and say they are at the height of their competence or the peak of their efficiency.
No, we say powers.
It's language usually reserved for wizards, superheroes, or demigods. It implies that you are in your golden era, the absolute zenith of your creative, intellectual, or physical abilities.
The text uses the example of a cinematic genius director, someone whose latest film is considered a privilege to witness.
Right. You aren't just going to the theater to watch a movie. You are bearing witness to a mythological being wielding their powers at full strength.
It's a profound level of respect.
But as much as I love the grandeur of that language, I have to point out the melancholy embedded deeply within it.
The inevitable downside.
It's actually a bit heartbreaking if you follow the logic to its conclusion. The text explicitly states that a professional cannot stay at the peak forever.
No one can.
It specifically says this power waxes and wanes like the phases of the moon. The landscape of the industry will inevitably change. Age will eventually slow the surgeon's hands. New technology will shift the paradigm for the software developer.
Time comes for everyone.
So I have to ask you, does acknowledging that you are at the height of your powers automatically force you to confront your own eventual decline? Can a master actually enjoy the zenith? Or is it just the terrifying moment at the top of a roller coaster right before the unavoidable drop?
Well, you've identified the core tragedy inherent in the human condition, which is perfectly, if subtly, captured in the language of mastery. Yes, to recognize the height is to implicitly, inescapably acknowledge the descent.
It's built into the word itself.
A peak, by its very geographical definition, is a place where you cannot permanently reside. The air is too thin. There is nowhere left to climb. There is only the journey down.
It's a geographical trap.
And the true master knows this better than anyone else. The amateur, the beginner who is just learning the ropes, often suffers from the delusion that they will live and progress forever.
They think the graph always goes up.
But the master, precisely because they spent 20 brutal years honing the blade on the whetstone, intimately understands the physics of degradation. They know exactly how easily a blade can dull with use and time.
They can feel it happening.
They feel the ticking clock of their own biology. They feel the relentless pressure of their own mortality slowly creeping in on the skill they sacrificed absolutely everything to build.
So they climb the mountain. They survive the wind, they achieve fine art, they reach this lonely, peerless peak where they're literally a god-wielding superpowers. And then they look around, they realize they're totally alone. They realize they can't stay there, and the most terrifying thought hits them. This craft, this beautiful thing I bled for, is going to die when I do. My edge will disappear with me.
And that realization is the catalyst for the most profound psychological shift in the entire journey.
It changes everything.
That terrifying, beautiful understanding that the zenith is strictly temporary is what forces the true master to stop looking inward at their own blade and start looking outward.
Because they have to pass it on.
They realize their craft must outlive their own physical or intellectual ability to perform it. The survival of the art becomes more important than the survival of the ego.
Which transitions us perfectly, almost inevitably, to the fifth conceptual stage of the journey, the passing of the torch.
A crucial stage.
To ensure the craft survives the inevitable decline of the master, the text says the master must find a worthy apprentice and take someone under their wing.
And the shift in the source's imagery here is really striking.
It is a total 180.
We started with the obsessive, cold, inward-facing isolation of the stone whetstone. We moved through the violence of the agricultural wind. Now the master must adopt a posture of absolute vulnerability and protection.
The imagery is overwhelmingly tender. After all the harshness and grit we've discussed, we get this deeply emotional, protective, avian metaphor to take someone under your wing.
Let's picture the biological reality of that phrase for a moment.
Okay, paint the picture.
Picture a mother bird in the wild. She is perched high up, and she senses a massive destructive storm gathering on the horizon.
The wind is coming back.
Exactly. She knows her chicks are incredibly fragile. They don't have their adult feathers. They don't have the physical mass to resist the wind. They will freeze or be blown away.
They are basically chaff at this point.
Yes. So what does she do? She spreads her massive storm-tested wings, and she physically pulls the inexperienced, fragile chicks underneath her own body.
Oh, wow.
She absorbs the impact of the rain and the wind herself, creating a living, breathing shield so they can survive.
It is a stunning metaphor for mentorship. But if we translate this tender, natural imagery to the harsh, often unforgiving realities of a modern corporate or professional environment, it reveals something incredibly profound about the mechanics of career development.
What exactly is the storm in a major corporate law firm, or a high-pressure tech startup, or a busy hospital?
Right. The storm is the environment itself. It's vicious corporate politics. It's toxic middle management looking for a scapegoat. It's an enraged client threatening to pull their account.
The pressure can be immense.
But most of all, it's the sheer crushing psychological weight of professional inexperience. It's that moment when a junior employee makes their first massive mistake, the panic sets in, and they genuinely believe their career is permanently over.
We've all been there.
Yes. And the master, acting as the mentor, steps in to provide an artificial, protective barrier. The mentor uses their own accumulated political capital, their untouchable reputation, and their institutional power to absorb the brunt of the storm.
The CEO can't yell at the intern if the senior partner steps in front and says, "This was my call."
But why do they do it? Why take the risk? Because it takes a lot of capital to do that.
They do it so that the apprentice has a safe, quiet, protected space to undergo their own agonizing honing process.
Oh, we're back to the whetstone.
Remember, honing takes time. It requires a dark room. The mentor shields the apprentice from the violent wind of the ultimate filter, just long enough for the apprentice to develop their own density, their own heavy wheat.
So they don't get blown away prematurely.
The master essentially says, "I will take the political hits. I will handle the angry client. I will deal with the administration. You stay under here in the quiet, and you just focus entirely on sharpening your blade."
The examples the text provides here are incredibly resonant because they happen every day. It describes a senior, highly respected architect who intervenes after a disastrous client presentation.
Classic scenario.
A first-year employee completely botches the pitch, freezes up, and is terrified they're going to be fired. The senior architect pulls them aside, takes the blame with the partners, and prevents the junior employee from quitting out of shame.
And that changes the trajectory of that young person's life.
Or another example, the chief of surgery, this intimidating, peerless god of the operating room who usually demands perfection, intentionally pulling a visibly shaking junior nurse aside. Instead of screaming at her, the surgeon takes her under their wing, calmly teaches her the hidden secrets of the trade, and actively shields her from the wrath of the hospital administrators who want to write her up.
It is the ultimate act of professional generosity. The master is sacrificing their own energy and sometimes their own standing to ensure the next generation survives.
It really is. And the source actually does something very clever here. It poses a question of the day directly to its readers, and I want to adopt that and pose it directly to you, our listener, right now.
It's a great question.
As you are listening to this breakdown of the master's path, I want you to mentally scan back over your own career or your academic history or your creative life. Who took you under their wing?
Because someone definitely did.
Who is the person who spread their massive storm-tested wings and took the hit for you when you were just a fragile, inexperienced beginner? Who gave you the quiet space to hone your blade?
Because if we are honest with ourselves, everyone who has achieved any level of competence has someone provide that shield, even if only for a brief moment.
Absolutely. And that is the deepest truth that this entire deep dive reveals. We love the myth of the self-made genius. We love the story of the lone wolf who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and conquers the world alone.
But it's just a myth.
The language of mastery exposes that myth as a complete lie. Mastery is fundamentally not a solo endeavor. Yes, the time at the whetstone is isolated, but the survival of the craft relies entirely on a continuous, unbroken chain of generational protection.
If the masters at the zenith do not turn around and protect the beginners at the bottom, the craft simply dies.
The chain breaks.
It is an existential imperative for the survival of human knowledge. And when a master successfully passes their knowledge into the future through this kind of profound self-sacrificing mentorship, something miraculous happens.
What's that?
Their influence begins to stretch beyond the limitations of their own physical lifespan. The apprentice eventually becomes the master, carrying the original master's DNA, their unique techniques, their philosophy, forward into a future the original master will never see.
They cheat death.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Which means they have achieved the final, ultimate conceptual stage of the master's path.
Legacy. Section 6. Defying time. The text lays out the ultimate overarching goal of the entire journey of mastery, using two massive, weighty phrases, leaving an indelible mark and standing the test of time.
Let's break down the C2 adjective first, because it introduces yet another fascinating shift in our metaphorical journey.
Right, indelible.
We have moved from the heavy stones of blacksmithing, through the chaotic winds of farming, into the rigid mechanics of clockwork, past the soaring altitudes of sports and mythology, underneath the feathers of biology, and now, at the very end, we arrive in the realm of ink and writing.
Indelible ink, like a permanent marker or the ink used to sign a historic treaty.
Exactly. To understand the power of this word, we have to look at its literal definition. Indelible means something that cannot be erased, cannot be washed away by water, and cannot be removed by chemical means.
It's permanently there.
It stains the very fabric of reality permanently. Now, I want you to contrast the permanence of indelible ink with the earlier metaphor we discussed.
The chaff.
The papery shell of the wheat. Right. The chaff was so incredibly light, so lacking in substance, that a mere gust of wind on a calm afternoon was enough to blow it entirely into oblivion. It left no trace it was ever there.
It's completely forgotten.
But to leave an indelible mark on an industry or a culture or an academic field means that through your obsessive honing and your careful mentorship, you have created something so dense, so fundamentally bonded to the foundational fabric of your field that no amount of wind, no changing economic trends, no shifting technological paradigms can ever wash your influence away.
You've stained the industry forever.
Exactly.
The text gives some powerful examples of what this looks like in practice. It mentions a visionary founder who eventually steps down from their company due to age, but who leaves an indelible mark on the company culture.
Even when they aren't at the building anymore.
Right. Decades later, the employees are still making decisions based on the ethical framework that founder established, or a scientist whose groundbreaking genetics research leaves an indelible mark on modern medicine.
Future doctors might use vastly superior tools, but they are building on a foundation that scientists poured.
You can't unknow the science. You can't unfeel the cultural shift. The mark is permanent.
And if that mark is truly profound, if the master's influence shapes not just an industry but human civilization itself, the language scales up from mere ink into our final, most monumental metaphor.
Oh, I love this one.
The work will stand the test of time.
This is where we dive into the grand architectural imagery, and it is breathtaking. We aren't talking about tools or ink anymore. We're talking about the big stuff.
The monumental structures.
The Roman Colosseum, the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Pantheon. These are colossal structures built by masters thousands of years ago. And I want you to think about the specific, brutal, unyielding threats these structures have had to survive, just to still be visible today.
They have faced the ultimate antagonist.
Yes. They have survived uncountable violent earthquakes trying to tear their foundations apart. They have stood silently while raging wars and massive empires rose and collapsed entirely around them.
Century after century.
They have been blasted by endless scouring sandstorms, baked by the sun, and eaten by acid rain. Time itself is the ultimate destructive force, testing the structural integrity of these buildings with every weapon in its arsenal.
And yet,
And yet, after millennia of relentless bombardment, They are still standing. They refuse to be blown away.
If we synthesize this entire conceptual journey we've been exploring today, this architectural defiance is the magnificent, awe-inspiring payoff.
It really brings it all together.
Think about the massive distance we have traveled in this narrative. We started by looking at a solitary, unknown individual, hunched over a cold whetstone in a dark room, obsessively making tiny, almost invisible scratches on a piece of steel.
Just grinding away.
And we end the journey here, gazing up at the sheer scale of the Great Pyramids, defying the millennia.
The microscopic scratch becomes the monumental stone.
Precisely. The language of mastery, ultimately, is the language of human permanence in the face of inevitable decay.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
When we say that Shakespeare's plays, exploring the depths of universal human emotion, have stood the test of time, or that the core principles of ethical leadership outlast the constant, chaotic churn of technological changes, we are recognizing something profound.
What's that?
We are recognizing that human excellence, when pushed to its absolute limits, can achieve a literal form of immortality.
The master themselves will die, the body will inevitably fail, the height of their powers will wane, and their personal zenith will be lost to history.
But the craft remains.
Yes, but the craft itself, if it is honed obsessively in the dark, if it is tested and filtered through the violent winds of crisis, if it is perfected into a subconscious fine art, and if it is carefully, generously passed to an apprentice under a protective wing, that craft hardens into stone.
It becomes a monumental structure.
Exactly. It becomes a monumental structure that future generations can navigate their own lives by.
That's an incredible thought.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of philosophical and linguistic ground today. I want to unpack this whole journey one last time, just to see the incredible, cohesive arc we've traveled through the English language.
Let's do it.
We started with the harsh, tactile friction of the whetstone, the lonely, obsessive discipline of honing the craft in isolation. Then we dragged that newly sharpened blade out into the brutal wind of the harvest, facing the ultimate filter that blew away the lightweight, papery chaff and left only the heavy, substantial wheat.
We then watched that survivor refine their daily work until it completely transcended utility, becoming an aesthetic fine art, running smoothly on the hidden, subconscious clockwork of flawless execution.
From there, we saw them climb to the mythological heights, reaching a lonely zenith where they operated entirely in a league of their own, wielding supernatural powers.
But knowing that gravity and mortality always win, we watched them transform from a solitary, untouchable god into a fiercely protective mother bird, spreading massive wings to shield the fragile future of their craft from the corporate storms.
And finally, through that ultimate act of selfless mentorship, we saw their life's work turn into indelible, permanent ink, rising up as monumental stone pyramids, built to stand defiant against the endless, scouring winds of time itself.
It is a profoundly moving, deeply human narrative, and it's hidden right there inside our everyday vocabulary.
It's amazing that we use these words all the time without thinking about it.
It reminds us that the words we use casually in emails or meetings carry the immense weight of human history and human striving within them. It forces us to respect the language and to respect the long, arduous path of those who truly master their disciplines.
It really does. Which leaves me with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over today as you log back into your computer and go back to your own work.
Oh, I like this.
We just spent this entire deep dive exploring how our current C2 vocabulary for ultimate mastery relies heavily on these ancient, highly physical concepts: swords, farming, avian biology, and stone pyramids.
Right, the tactile world.
Those were the defining physical realities of the ancestors who built the English language. But our world has fundamentally changed. We live in the digital ether now.
The physical landscape has been basically replaced by the virtual.
Exactly. So if language is a living thing that is always evolving to reflect its environment, what physical actions from our modern digital world today will become the metaphors of mastery for generations living hundreds of years from now?
That is a phenomenal question.
Centuries in the future, when people don't even know what a whetstone is, will compiling the code become a metaphor for perfectly organizing your thoughts? Will prompting the AI eventually evolve into a deep philosophical idiom for asking the universe the right questions?
Wild to think about.
What are the indelible marks that our current, seemingly ephemeral technology will leave on the language of excellence itself?
The digital whetstones of tomorrow are being invented by the masters of today.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the master's path. Keep your eyes open this week. Look out for the true masters operating quietly in your own life, and maybe take a moment to reach out and thank whoever it was that spread their wings and took you under theirs when you needed it most. We'll catch you on the next one. Keep honing. It really doesn't matter what field you operate in. Like, you could be a cutthroat executive sitting in some glass-walled boardroom or an avant-garde painter covered in turpentine in a Brooklyn studio.
Yeah.
Or, honestly, just navigating the incredibly complex logistics of your daily life, right? Managing a household. Because eventually, every single one of us has to face the exact same completely undisputed champion of the universe.
Oh, yeah. A passage of time.
Exactly.
Right.
Time. It is the one metric no professional, no human being can outrun. I mean, even the absolute greatest CEOs, the most brilliant artists, the visionary leaders that shape our world, eventually, the clock runs out.
Right.
They all have to step off the stage.
It's the great inescapable reality. Every career, every era of dominance, no matter how illustrious or industry-defining it is, it has a definitive expiration date.
Yeah.
And that forces a confrontation with mortality. Which is interesting, because we don't often talk about professional mortality, but it's the specter that's just haunting every ambitious person.
Absolutely, because you build something monumental, and then you are faced with this terrifying prospect of, well, leaving it behind, or, almost worse, watching it decline while you are still at the helm.
Right.
And that tension between building a legacy and facing the end of it is exactly what we are dissecting today.
Yeah.
So our source material for this deep dive is this comprehensive, just fascinating linguistic masterclass focused on a framework they call the master's path.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
But, to be clear, this isn't going to be some dry grammar lesson or like a dictionary reading of idioms. Our mission today is to unpack the breathtaking, incredibly epic, and honestly highly emotional imagery that the English language has evolved to describe this exact journey.
And the language we use, it's never accidental.
Right.
These specific idioms and metaphors we're about to explore, they've survived for centuries because they perfectly encapsulate the psychology of success and, frankly, the fear of fading away.
Yeah, we are tracing how a legend crafts their final masterpiece, the incredibly fragile mechanics of transferring power to the next generation, and how someone leaves a permanent footprint behind. We're basically exploring the architecture of human ambition.
When we decode these phrases, we are actually decoding the desperate human desire to be remembered.
Yeah.
And the immense psychological burden that comes with achieving greatness.
Which is heavy stuff. And to ground us in that history, I just have to point out the visual you set up today for this deep dive. Your backdrop is this phenomenal golden-hued ancient library vibe.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
I'm seeing historical artifacts, models of Roman aqueducts, and what looks like actual Olympic wreaths sitting on the shelves behind you.
I try to set the mood.
It's the perfect anchor for this conversation, because to understand modern corporate or artistic ambition, we're going to have to travel back to antiquity.
We really do.
So, the source material argues that the very first psychological trait of a true legend, a master, is a specific type of restlessness. Like, even after they achieve massive wealth, even when they reach the pinnacle of their industry, they refuse to stop. And the phrase we use is that they refuse to rest on their laurels.
Yeah. And to truly understand the psychological weight of that phrase, we have to travel back to Greco-Roman history. Mm-hmm. Specifically, we need to look at the Pythian Games.
Okay.
Which were they were the precursor to, and often considered even more prestigious than, the ancient Olympic Games in certain eras. These were held in Delphi, honoring Apollo.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because when we picture the Olympics today, the image is universally a heavy gold medal. We imagine an athlete like biting into a solid disc of precious metal on a podium.
Exactly.
But the ancient prize economy was completely different, right?
Oh, entirely different. The ancients didn't hand out gold or silver or bronze for athletic or artistic supremacy. When a competitor achieved the ultimate victory, when they proved themselves to be the absolute pinnacle of human physical or creative capability, they were crowned with a wreath.
Just a wreath.
Yeah, woven from the leaves of the bay laurel tree. That simple, incredibly fragile ring of foliage was the ultimate symbol of status in the ancient world.
But there is an inherent contradiction there that has always fascinated me. I mean, you have athletes who spend their entire lives training, enduring brutal Spartan-level discipline, and the ultimate prize is just organic matter.
Right.
It's a circle of leaves that is going to dry out, turn brown, and crumble into dust in a matter of weeks. I mean, it seems like a terrible return on investment. Why not give them something permanent?
Well, the impermanence is exactly the point. In Greek mythology, the laurel tree is associated with Apollo, right? The god of music, poetry, and archery. So the wreath was sacred. But its biological reality, the fact that it literally withers, served as a built-in philosophical reminder, glory is fleeting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You are a champion today, but tomorrow the leaves dry out. The title doesn't sustain you forever.
And yet, if we look at human psychology, the instinct to just stop working once you've won the ultimate prize is overwhelming. I mean, you train, you win, you get the wreath. The immediate biological urge is to pull up a chair, put the wreath on your head, and say, I am the champion, I have arrived, somebody bring me some grapes.
Exactly. Which is the neurological trap of complacency.
Right.
What's fascinating here is that when we achieve a massive goal, our brains release a flood of dopamine. It's intoxicating.
Right.
But dopamine baselines reset quickly. If you just sit there wearing that drying wreath, you are no longer generating new achievements. You're essentially demanding that the world continue to reward you for a past dopamine spike.
Which never works out.
No. You become entirely reliant on who you were, not who you are.
You become a museum exhibit of your own past. Like, you are living in the echo of your own applause. And I think that is why the modern connotation of resting on your laurels is so overwhelmingly negative. It's no longer a celebration, it's an indictment.
It really is.
Yeah.
It implies a dangerous, almost parasitic relationship with your own history. Because the world keeps moving, the market shifts, technology evolves, new athletes train harder.
Yeah.
The champion who sits still while wearing last year's laurel wreath is quickly rendered obsolete.
There is a perfect modern business parallel to this that the source material touches on. And if we look at the specific history of a company like Research in Motion, the creators of the BlackBerry, we see this exact psychological trap play out in real time.
Oh, such a good example.
Right. In the mid to late 2000s, BlackBerry was the undisputed king of the corporate world. They had the laurel wreath, they owned the smartphone market, presidents, CEOs, everyone had to have that physical keyboard.
And their engineering of that physical keyboard, the security protocols they built, that was their initial mastery. It was brilliant. But their reaction to that success is a textbook case of resting on their laurels. When the paradigm began to shift, specifically with the introduction of touchscreens and app ecosystems, the leadership at BlackBerry essentially pointed to their past sales figures.
Right. They just held up their old trophies.
Exactly. They believed their past success was a permanent shield against future innovation.
They looked at the first iPhone and scoffed. They literally couldn't comprehend that a consumer would want a phone without a physical keyboard because the physical keyboard was the thing that won them their laurel wreath in the first place.
Right.
So they stopped pushing the boundaries of their own hardware, assuming the market would simply continue to bow to them indefinitely. Meanwhile, competitors who had zero laurels to rest on, who were operating out of pure hunger, completely decimated them.
It highlights the difference between temporary dominance and the master's path. The master is terrified of complacency. They view their past success not as a destination where they can set up camp, but merely as a foundation to build the next, more complex structure.
Yeah.
The joy isn't in wearing the wreath. The joy is in the friction of the pursuit.
Which perfectly explains the second example in our material.
Yeah.
Think about a filmmaker who wins Best Director at the Academy Awards. They've reached the absolute apex of their industry.
The peak.
The natural inclination for most people would be to leverage that Oscar into an incredibly safe, highly lucrative franchise movie. Just cash the checks.
Oh, absolutely.
But the true master immediately pivots and starts writing some bizarre, highly experimental, independently financed screenplay. They deliberately introduce the risk of failure back into their lives because the absence of friction feels like death to them.
And that continuous, restless forward momentum leads us to a necessary climax. Because if the master absolutely refuses to sit in the rocking chair, if they keep pushing their own boundaries year after year, they are inherently building toward a singular, definitive peak.
Right.
They are driving toward what the framework calls a crowning achievement.
Okay, so we are shifting the imagery here from the dusty, ancient Olympic Stadium to the grand, opulent halls of a royal palace. The crowning achievement.
Yeah, it's a heavy, magnificent metaphor. And it's steeped in the mechanics of monarchy.
And the literal mechanics of a coronation are fascinating. If you look at the coronation of a British monarch in Westminster Abbey, it is not a quick celebratory high five.
No, not at all.
It is a grueling, hours-long endurance test. There are anointings, heavy robes, complex oaths, and just a staggering amount of pageantry. But the absolute climax of this exhausting process, the moment where the tension breaks and authority is finalized, is the literal lowering of the crown onto the monarch's head.
And we have to consider the physical reality of that crown to understand the metaphor. St. Edward's crown, for instance, weighs nearly 5 pounds.
That is incredibly heavy for a hat.
Right. It is made of solid gold and hundreds of precious stones. When it was placed on a person's head, they physically feel the immense crushing weight of their new authority. They cannot tilt their head or the crown will fall. They must hold themselves perfectly upright.
So when we adapt that to professional language, a crowning achievement isn't just a really good project you finished on a Tuesday. It is the defining masterpiece that officially completes your career.
Yes.
It's the culmination of all the grueling, unglamorous rituals, the late nights, the failed experiments, the daily grind, resulting in a moment of undeniable, heavy, golden perfection. It is the first sentence of your obituary.
Exactly. It defines the entire narrative of a life's work. Consider Jonas Salk.
Okay.
He was a brilliant medical researcher.
Yeah.
And he did incredible foundational work on the influenza vaccine in the 1940s. That work was important. It was a success.
Sure.
But it was not his crowning achievement. His crowning achievement was the development of the polio vaccine in 1955.
Because it completely altered the trajectory of human health on a global scale.
Yes. All of his previous research, his education, his hours in the laboratory, all of it was essentially preparation for that singular monumental breakthrough. Once the polio vaccine was proven effective, that became the crown. It locked his legacy into the history books forever.
Another great lens for this is architecture. You can have an architect who designs 20 highly functional, beautiful civic buildings over 3 decades. She's respected, she's wealthy, she has a great career.
Right.
But then in her 60s, she wins the commission to design a new national museum or an opera house. Think of Jørn Utzon with the Sydney Opera House. That structure is so iconic, so revolutionary in its engineering and aesthetic, that it immediately eclipses everything else they've ever done. The previous 20 buildings were just practice.
It raises an interesting psychological dilemma, though.
Oh.
If you achieve your crowning achievement relatively early in your life, what happens the morning after?
Huh?
How do you wake up and go to work when you know you will never, ever surpass what you've already done?
Wow, yeah. That is the tragedy of peaking early. If you write the great American novel at age 30, you have to live the next 50 years knowing you are basically operating in your own shadow.
Which brings us to the inevitable reality. Whether you achieve that crown at 30 or at 80, time remains undefeated. The master must eventually exit the stage. The work has to stop.
Right.
The question then becomes one of aesthetics and intentionality. How do you construct your own exit?
And this is where the source material introduces a choice between tragedy and triumph. Once the masterpiece is finished, how do you say goodbye to the public? The first option is one of the most poignant, heartbreakingly beautiful concepts in our language, the swan song.
The swan song is a masterpiece of mythological framing. To understand the emotional resonance of this idiom, we have to look back again to ancient Greece. Playwrights like Aeschylus and philosophers like Plato referenced a specific legend regarding the mute swan.
Right, the Greeks would observe these incredible, elegant white birds gliding across the water. And unlike other birds that squawk and chirp constantly, the Greeks believed the mute swan lived its entire life in a state of absolute perfect silence. It possessed no voice, it just existed in quiet grace.
But the myth states that right before the moment of its death, the swan is suddenly gifted with a voice. It opens its beak and sings one single, impossibly beautiful, hauntingly tragic song.
Wow.
It pours its entire existence into one final melody, and then it dies.
Biologically, we know now that this isn't strictly true, right? Like, swans do make hissing and grunting noises. But the myth is so powerful because it taps into our desire for a poetic conclusion. When we call an artist's final work their swan song, we are framing their exit not as a cessation of labor, but as a final sacred offering to the world.
It is a majestic, emotionally charged farewell that explicitly embraces the tragedy of finality. A swan song requires vulnerability.
Yeah.
It is an artist or a leader acknowledging their own mortality, their own ending, and choosing to make that ending beautiful rather than simply fading into obscurity.
If we look at music history, a perfect example of a deliberate swan song is the album Abbey Road by the Beatles. By the time they entered the studio to record that album, The interpersonal relationships within the band were completely fractured.
Oh, they were a mess.
The business side was a disaster. They all fundamentally knew this was going to be the last time the four of them would ever record together.
And that knowledge of the impending end completely changed the texture of the work.
Exactly. Instead of phoning it in, they decided to put aside their vitriol and pour everything they had left into one final masterpiece. The entire second half of that album is a literal medley that culminates in a track simply called The End, where McCartney sings, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." It is a deliberate, highly orchestrated swan song.
Or consider David Bowie's final album, Black Star.
Oh, that's a brilliant example.
He recorded it while secretly battling terminal liver cancer. He knew he was dying. He took his own physical mortality and transformed it into a piece of avant-garde jazz rock. The music videos he shot for it showed him frail, in a hospital bed.
Yeah, he didn't hide it at all.
No, he utilized it as his final artistic statement. It forces the audience to interact with the art differently. When you know you are witnessing a swan song, you don't just consume the product, you revere it as a historical artifact.
But not every master wants to leave the audience weeping, right? Some leaders and creators completely reject the melancholic, tragic goodbye. They want the lights flashing, the adrenaline pumping, and the crowd screaming. They choose the second aesthetic exit, which is they want to go out on a high note.
Right. If the swan song is about accepting finality with poetic grace, going out on a high note is about asserting absolute control over your legacy through performative peak. We shift our metaphor here from the quiet natural world to the highly engineered, high-stakes environment of the Grand Opera House.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this relies on understanding the physical mechanics of opera singing. Imagine a brilliant soprano at the end of a grueling 3-hour performance.
She is physically exhausted.
Yes, her diaphragm has been working like a bellows all night. At the climax of her final aria, instead of letting the music trail off softly, she summons every ounce of remaining breath, digs deep, and hits an impossibly high, pure, thunderous note.
And the physical risk there is immense. If her voice cracks, if she runs out of breath, she ruins the entire 3-hour performance.
But she doesn't crack. She hits the note, she sustains it, it echoes off the rafters, and the audience erupts into a standing ovation. She guarantees that her performance is unforgettable.
The underlying psychological principle here is intentionality. In behavioral economics, there is a concept developed by Daniel Kahneman called the peak end rule.
Okay, I love this.
Kahneman proved that humans do not evaluate an experience based on a mathematical average of every minute of that experience. Instead, our brains judge an experience almost entirely based on 2 moments: the absolute peak of intensity and how the experience ended.
That is fascinating. So if a career ends in a slow, depressing fizzle, that fizzle overwrites decades of previous excellence in the public memory.
Precisely. To go out on a high note in business or art is to hack the peak end rule. It means recognizing when you are at the absolute dizzying peak of your success and consciously choosing to walk off the stage right then and there. You intentionally truncate your own career to preserve the memory of your perfection.
It requires an unbelievable amount of discipline, because the temptation to stay when you are on top, when everyone is throwing money at you, when the board loves you, must be intoxicating. You think, I can keep doing this forever. But the master knows they can't.
A phenomenal example of this discipline is Jerry Seinfeld.
Yes.
In 1998, the sitcom Seinfeld was the biggest show on television. It was a cultural juggernaut. NBC was desperate to keep it going for a 10th season. They reportedly offered Seinfeld over $100 million, $5 million an episode, to just do one more year.
Which is life-altering generational wealth. 99% of humans would have signed that contract without blinking.
But Seinfeld understood the mechanics of the high note. He looked at the history of television and saw how many legendary shows overstayed their welcome, how they slowly became parodies of themselves in seasons 10, 11, or 12. He didn't want the audience to ever watch an episode and think, this used to be funnier.
Yeah.
So he turned down the $100 million and ended the show while it was still #1 in the ratings.
He preserved the integrity of the work forever. He left the audience desperately wanting more, which is the ultimate position of power.
But whether the master sings a swan song or goes out on a high note and drops the microphone, the result is exactly the same. They have exited the stage. The problem is, the world doesn't stop.
Yep.
The corporation still has thousands of employees. The industry still needs leadership. The master's exit creates a massive, dangerous vacuum, and power must be transferred. This brings us to the mechanics of succession. The master has to pass the baton.
And this is arguably the most terrifying, fragile moment in the life cycle of any organization. To pass the baton. We are utilizing a track and field metaphor here, specifically the 4x100-meter relay. And if you break down the physics of a relay race, it is a miracle they don't drop the baton every single time.
It is an exercise in extreme velocity matching and microscopic synchronization.
Think about the mechanics. You have an exchange zone on the track that is only 20 meters long. The first runner, the master who is ending their leg of the race, is sprinting into that zone at absolute top speed.
Right.
They're physically exhausted, their muscles are burning, but they're flying. The second runner, the successor, is waiting. But the successor cannot wait until the baton is handed to them to start running. If they do that, they start from zero velocity, and the team loses.
The successor has to start sprinting before they have the authority. They have to anticipate the arrival of the master.
Exactly. The successor accelerates, looking forward down the track, reaching their hand blindly backward. The first runner has to violently thrust that hollow aluminum tube into the waiting hand. If the first runner slows down too soon, they crash into the successor.
Yeah, disaster.
If the successor leaves too early, the first runner can't catch them and they run out of the exchange zone, disqualified. The timing has to be flawless.
When we map this physical frenzy onto corporate or professional transitions, it highlights why so many successions fail spectacularly. The handoff requires immense trust, ego suppression, and rigorous preparation.
Ego suppression is a huge part of it. The master, sprinting to the end of their career, has to actually let go of the baton.
Which is incredibly difficult for highly successful founders and leaders. It's often referred to as founder syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
The leader's entire identity is wrapped up in being the person holding the baton. They say they want a successor, they bring someone into the exchange zone, but when the moment comes to transfer the power, the founder unconsciously tightens their grip.
Right.
They refuse to let go. And what happens in the race if you don't let go?
You literally drag the next runner down to the track. You destroy their momentum. We saw a high-profile, very messy version of this at Disney recently with Bob Iger passing the baton to Bob Chapek. Iger's a legendary CEO. He built modern Disney. But when he handed the CEO title to Chapek, he didn't really leave the track.
Not at all.
He stayed on as executive chairman, he kept his office, he continued directing creative strategy. Chapek was trying to sprint forward, but Iger still had a hand on the baton. The resulting friction was catastrophic for the company's culture and stock price, ultimately leading to Iger having to come back and take the baton away.
It proves that a sloppy handoff can destroy decades of built-up speed. Contrast that with a successful transfer, which requires intense preparation in the dark. The blind reach in a relay isn't spontaneous. It is practiced thousands of times.
Right.
A senior partner at a law firm doesn't just toss a massive bet-the-company trial to a junior associate on a whim. They spend years in the exchange zone together. The senior partner has the junior associate draft the briefs, sit second chair, handle minor cross-examinations.
So building up that speed.
Yes. They match their velocities over years, so when the senior partner finally steps back, the junior is already running at full speed.
But let's flip the perspective. Let's get out of the mind of the master and look at the psychology of the successor. You are the second runner. You've just blindly grabbed the baton, and suddenly the entire weight of the organization is on your shoulders.
Terrifying.
The power imbalance is staggering because you aren't just doing a job, you are replacing a legend. The English language captures this specific crushing pressure with the idiom that you have big shoes to fill.
It is a wonderfully awkward, almost comical visual metaphor that masks a profound psychological burden.
Picture the imagery literally. A small child sneaks into the hallway and steps into their father's massive, heavy, weathered work boots. They try to walk around the house. Their feet are swimming in the leather.
Yeah, clomping around.
Right. Every step they take is clunky, unnatural, and visibly difficult. The boots swallow them whole. Visually, the child looks tiny by comparison.
And looking small by comparison is the terrifying reality for a successor. When you take over a role from someone who is a generational talent, universally beloved or outrageously successful, the environment you enter was custom built to fit their dimensions, not yours.
Your current ability is the small foot. Their legacy is the giant boot.
Exactly. The underlying psychological mechanism here is known as the anchoring effect. Human brains rely heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, to make subsequent judgments.
Okay.
When a legend vacates a role, Their specific style, their cadence, their decision-making process becomes the anchor for the entire audience or organization.
So the successor cannot be judged objectively on their own absolute merit. They're only judged relative to the anchor.
Right. If the legend was known for being a fiery, charismatic extrovert and the successor is a thoughtful, analytical introvert, the organization won't perceive the successor as thoughtful. Due to the anchoring effect, they will perceive them as lacking energy. The shoes are shaped for a different personality.
A brilliant example of navigating this was Trevor Noah taking over The Daily Show from Jon Stewart in 2015. Jon Stewart wasn't just a TV host, he was an institution.
Oh, absolutely.
He was the cultural anchor for political satire in America for 16 years. His shoes were impossibly big. When Trevor Noah took over, the initial critical and audience reaction was harsh.
Because the audience was anchored to Stewart's specific rhythm, his New York-centric outrage, and his specific comedic timing. Noah was a South African outsider with a cooler, more global, observational style.
Noah looked like he was stumbling around in Stewart's boots. But what Noah intelligently realized was that he couldn't grow his feet to fit the boots. He had to slowly, methodically change the shape of the footwear.
Right.
He brought in different correspondents. He shifted the focus to international issues. He utilized digital platforms in ways Stewart never did. He eventually crafted his own custom shoes, but he had to endure years of being told he didn't fit the original pair.
It is an incredibly dangerous phase of the master's path because many successors crack under the pressure of the anchoring effect and are fired before they can establish their own footing.
Which begs a larger structural question. Why are the original boots so massive in the first place? Why is the legend so revered that their shoes are impossible to fill?
It's a great question.
It is not simply because they had a long tenure. It is because they fundamentally altered the landscape they operated in. They did not just walk the trail, they paved the way.
To pave the way. This idiom brings us back to the models of Roman engineering you noted in the background earlier. It's a testament to the literal back-breaking transformation of the earth.
I think we take roads for granted today, so we lose the impact of this phrase. What was the physical reality of travel in Europe before the Romans started laying down infrastructure?
It was a logistical nightmare characterized by extreme friction. If you were a merchant, an army, or a messenger, you're dealing with muddy, rocky, heavily forested dirt paths.
Right.
A single heavy rainstorm could turn a trade route into an impassable bog for weeks. Wagons would shatter their axles, horses would break legs, and travelers were incredibly vulnerable to ambush because they were moving so slowly. Progress was grueling.
Then the Roman engineers arrive. And they don't just clear some brush and walk over the mud. They undertake one of the most massive infrastructure projects in human history.
They literally re-engineer the earth. Roman road construction was incredibly precise. They would dig a massive trench, sometimes 3 feet deep, called the fossa. Then they would lay down a foundation of heavy stones, the statument.
Wow.
Over that, a layer of crushed rock and gravel called the rudis. Then a layer of sand and cement, the nucleus, and finally the top layer, the summum dorsum, consisting of heavy, flat, perfectly fitted paving stones. They created a crowned, hard surface that cut in a straight line directly through the wilderness.
The amount of human labor required to do that, the digging, the cutting of stone by hand, the hauling, it was brutal, suffering work. The soldiers and engineers who built the Via Appia suffered immensely. But because they endured that friction, the journey became unimaginably smooth, safe, and fast for the millions of people who traveled over those stones for the next 2,000 years.
And when we translate that Roman engineering metaphor into a modern professional or social context, paving the way becomes the ultimate act of preliminary sacrifice.
Yeah.
The master does the difficult, groundbreaking, often dangerous and thankless work that reduces the friction for future generations. The pioneer takes the machete to the jungle, suffering the cuts and the exhaustion so that the next generation can casually walk down a paved sidewalk.
The source material points to the history of science as a profound example of this. Think about female scientists in the mid-20th century. Women like Rosalind Franklin or Frances Oldham Kelsey at the FDA.
Oh, perfect examples.
They were operating in an environment of intense institutionalized discrimination. The academic and professional paths for women were muddy, rocky, and deeply hostile. Every single day of their professional lives was filled with immense friction just to be allowed in the room.
But their sheer brilliance, their refusal to quit, and their willingness to endure that hostility laid down the foundational stones.
They dug the trench, they laid the gravel, and because they paved the way, modern female researchers like Katalin Karikó, whose foundational work led to the mRNA vaccines, can lead global laboratories and win Nobel Prizes today with significantly less institutional friction.
Right.
The modern scientist is running on the road built by the pioneers.
The same applies to early civil rights activists who faced physical violence and imprisonment to build the legal and social infrastructure of equality. They suffered the friction of the unpaved road so that others could march forward with speed and safety. Paving the way is the most generous act a master can perform.
So, the master paves the way. They endure the friction, they achieve the crown, they sing the swan song, they pass the baton, and they finally step off the stage. The timeline ends.
But does it?
Right. Does their influence ever truly end? Are they ever actually gone? This brings us to the final lingering phenomenon of the master's path. Even after retirement, even decades after their death, their presence still dictates the temperature of the room. The framework describes this by saying the legend casts a long shadow.
To cast a long shadow. This is a brilliant metaphor rooted in the physics of lighting and perspective. It speaks to the distortion of influence over time.
Visualize a tree in a courtyard. When the sun is at its absolute highest point at high noon, representing the peak of a person's active career, the shadow that tree casts is relatively small. It is concentrated right underneath its own branches. The light is shining directly down.
But as the day progresses toward evening, representing the twilight of a career, retirement, or death, the angle of the sun drops low on the horizon.
And because of that low angle, the physics change. Suddenly, that exact same normal-sized tree casts a massive, incredibly long, distorted shadow that stretches all the way across the courtyard, plunging the surrounding buildings, the grass, and the people into darkness. The shadow becomes vastly larger than the physical object creating it.
It eclipses the present moment. Idiomatically, when we say a legendary founder, artist, or political figure casts a long shadow, we mean that their specific philosophies, their rules, and the heavy mythological memory of their achievements continue to dominate an organization or an industry long after their physical body has left the room.
So what does this all mean? Is casting a long shadow actually a good thing? Because logically, a tree's shadow provides shade. It provides a cool refuge from the burning sun. It offers protection.
Right.
But biologically, things cannot grow in deep shade. A sapling planted in the long shadow of a massive oak tree will eventually wither and die because it is starved of the light it needs to photosynthesize. Is a long shadow a blessing or is it suffocating?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source material correctly identifies this as a dual-natured phenomenon. It is explicitly both. It is a blessing because the shadow provides an organization with a proven, highly successful framework. It gives them a historical prestige and a guiding philosophy that protects them from short-term, chaotic decision-making.
It's the shade.
Yes, but it becomes a curse when the shadow induces paralysis, when the reverence for the past prevents adaptation to the future.
A perfect historical example of the paralyzing shadow is the Walt Disney Company in the decade following Walt Disney's death in 1966. Walt was a visionary who paved the way for modern animation and theme parks. But after he died, his shadow over the animation studios was so long and so heavy that the remaining executives and animators became completely terrified to innovate.
They were paralyzed by a single question. What would Walt do?
Exactly. Instead of looking at the changing culture of the 1970s and asking what audiences wanted now, they held endless meetings trying to channel the ghost of a man who grew up in the early 1900s. They were managing the company to appease a phantom. As a result, the animation department stagnated terribly for years. The shadow was so long, it obscured their vision of the future, and new creative ideas literally starved in the dark.
They became a museum dedicated to their own founder. The only way out of a long shadow is for a successor to eventually chop down the metaphorical tree or to step entirely out of the courtyard and plant a new seed in direct sunlight.
Which is incredibly risky but absolutely necessary for survival. The other contemporary example of a massive shadow is Steve Jobs at Apple. Although in his case, the shadow extends beyond his own company. Jobs casts a long shadow over the entire global consumer electronics industry.
Well, without a doubt.
Every competitor, every industrial designer sketching a new phone, tablet, or laptop today is still operating inside the aesthetic and philosophical parameters Jobs laid out 15 years ago regarding minimalism, glass, and aluminum.
He essentially laid the Roman roads of modern technology, and his shadow still dictates the exact vehicles we're allowed to drive on them. That is the ultimate final realization of the master's path. It is achieving a state where your influence, your aesthetics, and your decisions outlive your physical participation in the timeline.
It's a profound realization, and it brings us to a synthesis of this entire journey we've taken today. We've mapped the architecture of ambition. It starts with the sheer restless terror of complacency, refusing to sit down and rest on your drying laurel wreaths. It drives toward enduring the heavy golden weight of a crowning achievement.
From there, it requires the emotional intelligence to navigate the exit, the vulnerability to offer a poetic swan song, or the intense discipline to manipulate the pecan rule and go out on a high note.
It demands the suppression of ego required to blindly pass the baton without dragging your successor down, and the empathy to understand that the person grabbing it has impossibly big shoes to fill.
And ultimately, it asks whether you have done the brutal work of paving the way for others, and whether the long shadow you inevitably leave behind will provide comforting shade or a suffocating darkness for the next generation. As the source material astutely points out, if you internalize these concepts, you aren't just memorizing vocabulary. You acquire the ability to speak about the human experience with the elegance of a poet and the strategic authority of a CEO.
And that is exactly why we wanted to spend an hour unpacking this framework with you. Because this isn't just about ancient athletes in Delphi or billionaires in Silicon Valley or historical legends. This timeline applies directly to you. It's a lens through which to view your own daily ambitions and your own trajectory. You possess the potential to endure the friction and pave the way for others in your own sphere, whether that is changing the culture of a massive corporation, lifting up a small community, or fundamentally altering the trajectory of your own family.
The mechanics of legacy and the relentless passage of time apply to us all, regardless of the scale of the stage we happen to be standing on.
Exactly. So we want to leave you with a final provocative thought. We want you to take the core questions embedded in this linguistic framework and actually mull them over today. Think about the specific legends in your own life. Who is the person that paved the way for you, who dug the trenches and laid down the stones so that your path through education, your career, or your personal life could be smoother?
Acknowledge the shadows you are currently operating within.
And as you look forward down the track of your own timeline, what do you want your ultimate crowning achievement to be? What is the heavy golden masterpiece you are grinding toward every day? Because like we said at the very beginning of this hour, time is the undisputed champion. It is completely undefeated. The clock will eventually run out for all of us, and we will all have to step off the stage. But if you walk the master's path with intention, well, your shadow might just stay behind.